Welcome to the Power of One. Today, we are going to have a very interesting conversation about incarceration and focusing on African Americans, but we'll touch on other races as well. But we do know that African Americans are treated just a little bit differently when it comes to the criminal justice center. And we're going to be speaking with a professor from LaSalle University, Caitlin. Welcome to the show. Caitlin, we're just going to dive right into this conversation and have a real talk. Why do you think it is, in all the years of studies that you've done, why do you think it is that men of color are incarcerated at an extremely higher rate than any other race?
Really important question. I think two things are happening. One is bias and discrimination at every stage of the system. And the second is what criminologists refer to as differential rates of offending by race. So for the first one, we know that Black men in particularly face disparate outcomes at every stage of the system. They're more likely to be stopped by police, more likely to be denied bail, more likely to have charges brought against them by prosecutors, more likely to be sentenced harshly by judges or juries, and then less likely to be granted parole at the end of the system. The second cause, though, is that we live in a society that's plagued by white privilege and disparate access to resources. While there may be no major differences in crimes like drug possession or sales among different racial groups, Black men do commit certain types of crimes, namely gun violence, robberies, at higher rates than white folks do. But the important question, of course, here is why, right? And we know that socioeconomic status and structural disadvantage play a huge role here. If someone grows up in a neighborhood that's been historically oppressed without access to education, safe housing, jobs, healthcare, etc., it should be no surprise that these are individuals more likely to engage in gun violence or commit armed robberies. And unfortunately, due to our history of redlining and a variety of other factors, it's Black people who are more likely to grow up in neighborhoods like this.
Have you seen an increase over the years in Black women being incarcerated?
So let me start by saying that the incarceration rate for Black women in the US is 1.6 times higher than the rate for white women. However, here's the interesting part. The rate for Black women has actually decreased over the past 20 years. So between 2000 and 2021, the incarceration rate for Black women has declined by 70%, and the rate for white women has increased by 12%. So while there's still a higher proportion of Black women incarcerated than white women, the trends over time have been moving in opposite directions. And part of that is just coming out of the late 1990s, the incarceration rate for Black women was just ridiculously high.
I want to go off for a second, and we're talking about incarceration, which we're talking about crime. And I want to ask this question to you, and this question has been presented time and time again. And when I was the executive director for Northwest Victim Services, I would go to meeting after meeting after meeting. Many of them I thought were pointless. I'm going to say that. So we're going to have an uncensored, uncut conversation for a little while. And then you have agencies that are getting all this money to stop crime. Now tell me if this is not in your wheelhouse. And I've never said this before publicly. I don't know if we can 100% stop crime. Tell me if I'm wrong. I don't know if you can determine when someone is going to go and shoot someone, when someone is going to bomb a city. You just don't know when someone is going to be set off to do this. So I'm going to ask you this question. How do we stop crime? And do you think we can stop crime?
I don't think that all crime can ever be stopped. There will always be harms done to other humans, But I do think that we can reframe how we prevent crime and how we respond to harms after they've been committed. So at the prevention side, here's where I think the abolition movement is really valuable. And so there's, I think, a lot of myths about when we talk about police or prison abolition. Abolition isn't the idea that we just like bulldoze all prisons today and fire every cop. It's really about a change in goals. So instead of thinking it's police and prisons that generate public safety, we're thinking from an abolition lens that we know that it's investment in community resources that create public safety, right? Our dominant narrative is that if we just police better, or we imprison better, or we identify who that person is who's going to commit the crime, that's going to create public safety. But the abolition movement forces us to think about how can we make it so police and prisons are not necessary because we've addressed the root causes of crime, the social causes of crime in the first place, right? We've gotten to this place where prison is the response of first resort, not last resort, right? Prison, as somebody commits a crime, and the gut reaction that we've all grown up with is to say, how do we deal with that? Is to imprison that person, right? We've been so deeply ingrained in that it's stolen our ability to even imagine something else. And so I think investment in restorative models can be really valuable for this. And then, of course, the front end prevention pieces is critical.
I agree, in great response. And that will lead me into, how does lack of education and poverty play a part in so many African American men being incarcerated?
This is a huge factor. Over 40% of the incarcerated population don't even have a high school diploma or a GED, right? That's compared to only 18% in our general US population, which is still outrageously high to think, right? 1 out of 5 Americans don't have a high school diploma or GED, but it's essentially double that behind bars. And I'm sure your viewers can think of all of the ways that a lack of education and poverty can increase the likelihood of someone committing crime. But what's particularly disappointing about this is that the prison experience could be an opportunity to ameliorate some of these inequities. But access to education, access to job training behind bars are very difficult to come by. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some really incredible isolated programs doing great work behind bars, but our system as a whole is not set up to do this. And then when people come home, they can be legally banned from certain types of occupations. They have to check the box, the felon box on an application. They can be banned from receiving student loans. So there's lots of obstacles we place that make the role of education and poverty even worse.
So that leads me into school to prison pipeline. When you have children who are misbehaving in school for whatever reason, they're expelled. And some of them can actually be put into a juvenile system. I read a book not too long ago, and it spoke about how you have 2 students. One is an African American student, one is a Caucasian student. But this African American student made some kind of Molotov cocktail, just something that he saw, wasn't trying to harm anybody. He just saw it and he just made it, forgot it was in his book bag. There was a Caucasian student who did the same thing. Now, with the African American student, they expelled the student. He's before the Criminal Justice Center for juveniles. The Caucasian student did the same exact thing. And they said, oh, we're going to put you in chemistry class. School to prison pipeline for young African American males. Speak to that.
Absolutely. So we know that schools that employ things like zero tolerance policies often respond to minor infractions with severe punishments, such as suspensions or expulsions. And this approach can disproportionately affect all marginalized students, including Black and brown kids, students with disabilities, or those from low-income families. And many of those are, of course, very overlapping groups. So instead of addressing underlying issues, zero tolerance policies can push students out of the educational system and into the juvenile, quote, justice system. Research has also shown us that frequent suspensions and expulsions are associated with higher dropout rates and increased involvement with the criminal legal system in the future. When students are removed from their learning environment, they miss out on instructional time and may become disengaged from school. It's harder for them to stay interested. And this makes them, of course, more susceptible to engaging in crime or having encounters with the police. And we also know, as you spoke to, there's great disparity in how school discipline is administered, with students of color facing harsher penalties compared to their peers for similar behaviors. And some really important research related to colorism has been done in this area as well. Studies have shown that darker skinned Black students are more likely to receive harsher punitive consequences than lighter skinned Black students, even when it's an administrator of color choosing the punishments. So schools really need to do a better job of providing adequate support services for students who are facing emotional or behavioral health problems, so that we're addressing the root causes of behavior issues. Students need access to things like counseling and mental health support and interventions that address their individualized needs. Again, I think schools need to do a better job of implementing restorative justice programs as well, right? Restorative interventions can teach kids really valuable conflict resolution skills. Also can sometimes teach teachers or staff helpful conflict resolution skills while addressing the root causes of behavior, as opposed to just kicking kids out of school.
So we've spoken about poverty and lack of education, untreated trauma. Untreated trauma, a lot of African American youth often deal with. And then they go to school, and because of all of that trauma that they're carrying, they act out in school, and again, leading to suspension, untreated trauma, and mental illness. There are young African American men who have mental illness, and which then can lead them into doing some things that will eventually put them in jail. Our system in prison isn't actually treating people who have traumas, young African American men, and young African American men or males, adult males who have a mental illness. Is it treating them so when they're released back in society, they do not return?
Yeah, I hear you asking about whether or not prisons are set up to rehabilitate people and to address trauma. And are there isolated programs within the prison system that are truly dedicated to helping people heal and change their lives? Of course. And many of those programs, the best ones at least, tend to be run by other people currently or formerly incarcerated themselves. But I think at the end of the day, there are really profound questions about whether healing or rehabilitation are even possible, or at best likely, within a system which is really focused on dehumanizing people who are incarcerated, right? The incarceration experience is at its core a dehumanizing process. People are treated as a number, not their name, or increasingly as a QR code on their wristband, not even a number. And so if we think about all of the possible goals of corrections, I would say rehabilitation is not at the top of the list, knowing what we know about the trauma that's created within the incarceration experience, right? Putting people in cages is not a way to treat trauma. It's a way to exacerbate trauma. And so the one goal that prisons are really good at accomplishing is retribution. And retribution means that the way we achieve justice is to make sure the person who has caused harm has to suffer, right? And the person who has caused the harm has to be harmed themselves. This is the eye for an eye type mentality. And we've been so ingrained in this idea of that's how we set things right. When somebody harms somebody else, the way that justice is done, the way that we even things out, is for that person to experience something negative. But the reason this is so dangerous, this retributive framework, is that it doesn't need to defend its policies in the interest of public safety or in the interest of reducing recidivism or helping people heal through rehabilitation. We know that sending people to prison increases their likelihood of recidivism, not decreases it. And yet when somebody commits a robbery or a burglary or whatever, our sense of justice being done means that person deserves to suffer for that crime and suffer in prison, even if it's not treating their unresolved trauma that you spoke to.
Okay, let's have another uncensored, uncut moment. Is it money in keeping people in prison? Because I can't understand for the life of me how this little African American girl from West Oak Lane can figure some things out. But then at the top of the system, it seems like they want to have people in prison, mainly African American men, because they keep building these prisons and they're putting them in there. There may be people who can't make bail, and I think you spoke to that earlier, and they're sitting in prison for something minor and they can't make bail, but they're sitting in prison for years. So is it that money is built off of them? That's why this process still happens?
I think there's two main things, and money is one of them. So we know that there are huge financial incentives. The prison industrial complex is so ingrained in every aspect of our culture and our society, right? That it's, even though it's less than 10% of all people incarcerated are within a private prison, so that there's a private company running the entire institution, every single public facility has contracts to private corporations that provide everything from healthcare services to the food to corrections officers and inmate uniforms, so that there are all of these companies that benefit from mass incarceration. There are also nearly every company you can imagine relies on prison labor, prison slave labor in many ways, right? In the state of Pennsylvania, the most that somebody can make per hour is 40 cents an hour. Most jobs are closer to 15 cents an hour. And so corporations ranging from Starbucks to Victoria's Secret to Whole Foods all rely on cheap inmate labor. And so is there a huge financial incentive? As somebody who is a prison abolitionist, I would say I would try in my life to avoid going to or serving any corporation that uses prison labor. That is a nearly impossible endeavor to take on because it is so rampant.
You are blowing my mind right now. Now, you just said Victoria's Secret. Are you serious?
Yes, so there's truth to, if you're a fan of the Orange is the New Black TV series, there's the one season in which the women are sewing underwear. The women incarcerated are sewing underwear. Yes, Victoria's Secret. Starbucks has gotten a lot of attention for this as well. Phone companies like AT&T or banks use people incarcerated as customer service representatives, so that if you call into one of these helpline for a corporation, it's possible you're talking to somebody who's currently incarcerated who's getting paid cents an hour. So I think to your original question about like, why does this seem like a no-brainer? That the system that we have is ridiculously failing on every level. One reason that we still keep it is the financial incentive. But I think an equally important one is back to this idea of retribution, because we've been so ingrained with this idea that when somebody commits a harm, the way that we fix that harm is to make the person suffer in prison. That really limits our other options, our other responses. And so I think that that's a major obstacle to overcoming the existing system as well.
So speak to the difference with county prison and state prisons.
Sure. So one difference is sentence length. In most states, it's something like a 1 or 2 year. In Pennsylvania, it's a funky 23 and a half months is the cutoff. So in Pennsylvania, if you're sentenced to 23 and a half months or less, you serve that time within the county prison, within the county jail system. If your sentence is over 23 and a half months, then you serve that in a state prison. That can be really a critical cutoff point, considering that state prisons can be located anywhere throughout the state, right? That especially if you are somebody from Philadelphia and you get sent to a state prison that's out near Pittsburgh or in the central Pennsylvania, that makes family visitation really difficult. And so that really matters, that distance. We also know that most county prison systems are actually a prison system and a jail system combined. So jail is for people who are serving these shorter sentences, like 23 and a half months or less, as well as for people who have not yet been convicted. So as you had spoke to about people who are unable to make bail or who were not given the opportunity of bail, and that nationwide, over 80% of people incarcerated in county prisons are not yet convicted. And so we can ask really key questions about our philosophy of innocent until proven guilty if somebody's going to be locked up sometimes for years until their case is resolved.
So you have publications, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Share with the viewers how they can access those publications.
Sure. So one of the best ways is through LaSalle's website has a list of my different publications. Some of them that are normally behind a paywall, I have available through LaSalle's website called Digital Commons is what it's called. So just Googling my name and Digital Commons will open up some of those options. So some of my publications have focused on what are the factors that contribute to recidivism, particularly related to family support. So my research had found that emotional support from family after somebody comes home is actually more important than financial support from family. I've also done a number of program evaluations, so partnering with criminal justice organizations to determine whether the programs that they're using are reducing recidivism in the ways that they expect them to. So, for example, a reentry court program, a mentoring court program are key ones that I've published on recently.
Well, I want to thank you so much for all that you're doing and all of these publications and all the research that you've done. Do you know if there are any laws out there, or have you helped with any laws that will somehow help African American men and the prison system?
So I have been invited to provide expert testimony to the Pennsylvania State Senate a couple of times. One was related to gun violence, and in that testimony, I really encouraged our state senators to invest in community violence prevention as opposed to more punitive consequences, particularly for people with gun charges, that we know sentence lengths can be really long for those. I was also invited. There's something at the federal level called the U.S. Sentencing Commission that sets federal policy for sentencing, and I was invited to provide expert testimony related to expanding access to what's called compassionate release. So for people who are elderly and maybe facing health consequences, increasing their access to be able to be sent home as opposed to dying in a really inhumane way while behind bars. So those are some opportunities that I've been really grateful to have to contribute to public policy.
Thank you so much for your expertise. Thank you for your knowledge, and keep fighting for all of those who are treated unfairly at the Criminal Justice Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Hard conversation, but necessary conversation. And it is my dream and my hope that one day, everyone of every race, especially African Americans, will be treated equally. Peace and love.